Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast detailing the exploits and misadventures of our Southern California Malifaux meta. Today's episode is Welcome to Malifaux Part 1. What is Malifaux? My name is Jeff. I'm a player in the Southern California meta. I've been gaming for probably about 25 years now, which sounds like a really long time, but my dad was a gamer, so I got into it just growing up. I've played pretty much every kind of game out there. I particularly enjoy the old GW specialist games like Battlefleet Gothic and Necromunda, but I got into Malifaux around the time 10 Thunders came, and from my first experience, I was pretty much blown away, and it's been my game of choice ever since. And with me here are two other players from the SoCal meta, Jim and Colgan.
Hey guys, what's up?
Hello everyone.
So, Jim, how did you get into gaming?
Hey Jeff. So, I've been gaming since, I want to say high school, or at least early college. I mean, I've done a lot of roleplay games, and for tabletop games, I really got in the 40k scene. I think a lot of people start with Warhammer, either flavor, because it's such a big part of the wargaming scene. I've dabbled in, fantasy. I've dabbled in AOS. I've dabbled in Guild Ball. I tried War Hordes for a bit. Something was missing every time, and then I want to thank a particular shout out to Matt Stanley over in the East Coast Baltimore area for introducing me proper to Malifaux back in the beginning of 2nd edition. That really started me into making Malifaux my main game. It's been weird stuff ever since.
And how about you, Colgan? How did you get into gaming?
I guess I actually discovered tabletop gaming at first because I wandered into a Games Workshop thinking they sold video games, which I feel like is a pretty common experience because I remember going in there every now and then, and like the store attendant there would pick up a phone call and you'd have to explain to them that they don't actually sell video games.
Dude, that hasn't changed. I've been in there like this past year and people have done that.
So basically GameStop and Games Workshop should just merge.
Yes, I think that would be in everyone's best interest. Then we can get all those like secondhand armies on sale. But yeah, I want to say I was like in middle school or something. Neither of my parents or no one in my family was really big into gaming, but me and my brother were big into video games, and I just kind of fell in love with the idea of Space Marines. Because, like Super Guys and like Power Armor and stuff was really great for a kid, and I grew up on stuff like Power Rangers and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I remember, I think I started 3rd edition or something like that, and I'd be playing just wherever I could find it. I tried to pull in some of my childhood friends at the time, and started playing like, I don't even know if we ran by the points at that point. We were just like throwing models on the table and trying to figure out how things worked. And then ever since then, I've been doing tabletop gaming kind of off and on when I've been able to find like other people interested or find like, I guess, hobby shops that had small communities. And I started again recently. I was looking into all the new games that had come out, and I was really excited about the fact that skirmish games started becoming really popular, because I remember how painful it was to try and even get to 2,000 points in either 40k or fantasy.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And it was just like, there'd be so many times I'd start with these grandiose plans of like, oh, I'm gonna have this army. But then at like 1,000 points, I realized I like hated half the guys in my army. Or I didn't even like the army itself. So I started looking into other skirmish games, and I knew that one of the big ones was War Hordes. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much of a community in SoCal at the time. So I was kind of jumping around, and I ended up defaulting to Games Workshop skirmish games like Kill Team and Underworlds, just because everyone knows Games Workshop, and if I was going to find other people playing, I figured that was my best bet.
Right.
So I was playing Kill Team and Underworlds for a while, and I was like actively looking for some kind of group or trying to start my own. And that's actually when I got an invite from Jeff on this app for like finding other, I guess, board game players or whatever kind of games you have. And he actually invited me to come play Malifaux at the local store.
Yeah, that's, how we do it in Los Angeles. We just send people random texts and see who shows up. So I guess we hit the lottery with this one, because we actually got Colgan to show up, and he's been with us ever since. And that was, what, I guess it would be summer of 2019 or maybe fall.
Yeah, it was around there. It's like, I think it was like maybe June or something.
Right. Yeah, it was right around the time third edition for Malifaux had just come out. So, some of you may be coming to the podcast with some Malifaux experience. Since this is a Malifaux podcast, we assume most listeners will have at least some interest in it already. But just to start at the beginning, Malifaux is a skirmish miniatures game, which means that you have a crew of generally 7 to 10 models. And as Colgan mentioned, it means that there's a lower threshold for entry. And if you decide you don't like something, it's not that hard to switch to something else. It uses a victory point mechanic to determine the winner. So it's not just about killing. You have to complete these objectives, and you can actually win the game with no remaining models at the end, although that is pretty difficult. The thing that really sets it apart is that it has a non-dice resolution system. It uses a deck of cards. They call it a fate deck, but it's just a normal 54 card deck. So it's got the jokers included. It has suits that are custom to the world, but they're basically just the 4 suits, and you care about both the value of the card and the suit of the card, which adds another level of granularity.
Yeah, in addition, I felt like one of the big things that kind of drew me to Malifaux, or actually makes, I guess, the game experience really interesting, is in addition to flipping cards to generate numbers, you have something called a fate hand, which is basically just 6 or 7 cards that you can use to cheat into certain actions to either make them succeed or hopefully make your opponent fail.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which gives you, I think, an element of control as opposed to the dice games, right? Because even if you can re-roll a die, you're still relying on a random result, whereas with the fate hand, or the control hand,
you have some element of control over fate, right? But at the same time, you know, most crews in Malifaux average, 7 to 9 models? On average. Average models have 2 to 3 relevant actions they're taking a turn between bonus and normal actions. You have only a semblance of control of fate with your fate hand. The deck is still a predetermined fate because the deck is ordered after you shuffle it. And I think that's really cool thematically. Like, fate is set because you shuffled your deck, but you have this modicum of control over it. To say nothing of the fact that, you know, thematically, it's like you're in a saloon in a game of cards with another person, and you're both trying to cheat that fate.
right? Yeah, I mean, the control hand, I guess it gives you more sway than pull over fate. You can influence it, but you can't direct it.
And, like, honestly, one of the things I love most about it is just that it opens up a lot of interesting and unique mechanics for all of the crews and factions within Malifaux itself, as opposed to a lot of other war games I've played. Well, you know, mainly Games Workshop stuff. You know, you have, like, Space Marines who are just kind of, like, across the line, their stat lines, they're, like, a little bit stronger, a little bit tougher. They're kind of, like, I guess, the gold standard. And then all the other armies are like, well, they have more guys, but they're weaker. So you get more dice and, like, hopefully you roll well. But any changes they have is like, okay, they can re-roll this dice, or it's like they hit on a 3 or higher or like a 5 or higher. And that's kind of how you get differences, I guess, between factions. But at the end of the day, I felt like playing different armies didn't really feel that different to me, other than just like the aesthetics of it.
Right. Yeah, in a lot of games, they do tend to just have like a base stat line, and then variations of that are how you get the different armies or the different factions. But in Malifaux, playstyle can be quite different between crews, right? I mean, you can have crews that are very interactive and crews that kind of want to avoid direct conflict with the enemy. And in fact, one of the crews you started on was a crew that wants to avoid direct conflict.
Oh, yeah, Nelly and her journalists.
Right.
That was a fun one to start with. But yeah, I mean, like, part of the reason I wanted to start with her was just because I came from that wargaming background where you pretty much kill everything. And even with the war games that were supposed to be more objective based, it really broke down to, like, how well can you kill the other person using your flavor of armory.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, aside from the gameplay, the lore for Malifaux is pretty unique.
Oh my gosh, yes. If you're listening to this and you're familiar with Malifaux, you know that there's a free podcast that Weird puts out that has all the lore that they've published. You can get most of the lore for free through Drive-Thru RPG from their magazine, their e-zine, every faction, and there's 8 factions now, has a number of keywords, and each keyword is distinct. Each keyword is telling its own story. And in-game, a lot of that story is referenced in and reflected in the abilities of those models on the table.
Right.
So every game feels narrative. You want to talk Games Workshop stuff, any game that's like a Space Marine versus Space Marine, why would Space Marines fight each other? Sure, you can come up with a reason for it, but in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, sometimes it's weird. Like, why are my Grey Knights fighting orcs? Orcs don't deal with demons, blah blah blah. Malifaux? There is a legitimate reason for every keyword to fight any other keyword. Other thing that is really neat, I don't know if you guys have dived into this as much as I have, but the fact that the game world has progressed. It's something that Warmahordes had that I really appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the first edition fluff, and then you move to the third edition fluff, there are definite character arcs, definite advancements in story for different models.
Right.
And heck, you have the Dead Man's Hand. You have models that, for one reason or another, are no longer tournament legal, but lore-wise, there's a reason for every single one of those characters to no longer be an active player, but all of them could come back.
Right. And what's also, I think, pretty neat is that the player base has been able to influence the development of the story and even the release of the models, or which model ultimately gets added to the game.
Yeah, in 2nd edition, for those of you new to Malifaux in 3rd edition, there were 3 models in 2nd edition who their entire development process was influenced by a worldwide campaign where players would put in their results, play specific missions, and that impacted the result of these 3 very interesting models, both from a design and gameplay perspective.
Were those all masters, or which models?
Oh no, it was they're all enforcers. So it's Ferdinand Vogel, the werewolf lawyer, Serena Bowman, the nurse / nightmare of the Neverborn, and what's her name? The little necromancer, Marlena Webster. So the 3 of them, and frankly, their model themselves are really cool.
Yeah, they are.
Marlena's riding a teddy that looks out of the barely there limited edition sculpts, which for folks getting into the game, they may not care about it, but the fact that Weird has so many limited edition sculpts, for me, as a collector, as someone who enjoys having the aesthetics of my crew fit a certain vision, the idea that I can do things like have a Dreamer crew that is full of Teddy and Teddy analogs with the barely theirs, the fact that they consistently make them available through their online portal is really cool. And it opens the line up for creativity when, you do have a lot of monopose in Malifaux and not a lot of conversion, but we'll dive into conversion and other sorts of hobby elements, I think, in a future podcast. I could go on and on about that.
Right. But, I mean, one thing I think that Weird has done a good job of is that frequently I feel a master and that master's keyword will deliver a play style that feels thematically appropriate, so that if you like a master for its thematics, you should enjoy the play style that master then delivers.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. For me, one of the things that made it, I guess, a lot easier to get into Malifaux was kind of that character-driven thing that you were mentioning earlier, Jem. Like, having these masters basically being the cornerstone of your crew. Within each faction, you have a number of masters, and based on who your master is, it'll change your keyword, and it also kind of helps guide new players which models you should be taking. So, like, Nellie with their journalist crew, she has like the field journalists, the newsies, and all that stuff, and it's all built into the keyword. So just starting out, you already know, well, if I like Nellie, then I should probably start with collecting these guys, and they all have kind of like a synergistic play style that kind of teaches you through their abilities and stuff what kind of game you want to be playing.
Right.
And I know for a lot of the newer players, it kind of helped because you'd come in and you see these masters that are so distinct from each other, and their play styles are like radically different. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've been talking about Nellie a lot, And one of the things that I found really interesting is that one of her abilities was just that if you killed one of her models, she would debuff enemy models. So I was like, it's not even necessarily the worst thing in the world to, sacrifice some pieces or lose some of your guys. It's not just like all bad.
It is the worst thing in the world to lose your guys.
Well, like, and that's a great point. Like, I think one of your earlier games was against my Vix, right? Those are two very diametrically different crew designs.
Right.
Like, you have Nelly, who's all about controlling scheme markers and interactions, and the Vix are a mobile crew that can hit pretty hard, but they can't exactly take a hit themselves.
Yeah.
I am curious, what was that like, coming from a kill everything background like you did from, like, Warhammer, going in and having one of your earlier experiences being Nelly versus the Vix?
Right, so the reason I actually did pick Nelly, that was kind of a conscious choice. I was actually debating whether to start with the Vix or Nelly. And I wanted to just kind of force my hand into playing, I guess, the objective game, because it was something I felt like that was fairly unique to Malifaux, at least among the other games that I played before coming to Malifaux. Just the idea that I could still win the game pretty decisively without actually having much in the way of firepower, especially against, crews like the Vix or other killy things. That being said, my first few games with Nelly were definitely very rough, because I would be trying to use certain abilities to be more aggressive or try to attack more than I really should have been. But after getting in a few games, I realized it's kind of hard to see from my perspective, like, how annoying or how difficult it was for my opponents to actually engage against a lot of the journalists in Nelly's crew in a meaningful way. It's like, okay, you're tying them up, but I'm still scoring points. I'm still ahead of you, and it's up to you to try and close the gap.
Right. What were your expectations like when you picked up this Nelly crew? Because, as a newer player, all that you basically had to go on was that they were journalists, right? So did they deliver a playstyle that you expected to receive?
I would say they did. I guess it was interesting going into it, because I thought, even as journalists and stuff, I was imagining, with the whole war game background, they'd have some offensive things, like maybe they would just have like tricks, like, oh, like they can throw grenades, or they have like pen bombs, or some crazy stuff like amazing. That. Some like weird journalistic twist on weapons, like they jab a pen in your eye or something.
Well, the pen is mightier than the sword.
This is true.
But then looking at it, it's like Nelly, her only way of actually dealing damage is if people are already engaged, which isn't necessarily something you want.
Right.
Her field journalists don't actually have an active way of hurting anyone. Like, they can take pictures of people, like literally just taking pictures of people to kind of like slow them down or make it harder for them to like hit other people in your crew. And it was definitely a weird thing to kind of wrap my head around. But I think overall it really helped me understand the game more quickly after I got my first like 10 losses.
that definitely sounds rough, but I think that's pretty consistent with most games, but especially with Malifaux. I know, I've been playing Malifaux for a little bit, just been playing Malifaux for a little bit. Whenever we're trying new crews, I know I get my stuffing kicked out for the first 10 games or so, just trying to figure out all the keywords, because like you said earlier, Colgan, there's so much interplay in these keywords. There's so much going on in your 8 to 10 models. It's all you can do just to remember all the little if-then happenings.
Yeah, for sure. I feel every time I play a new master, it's almost like I'm starting over. Or, in fact, anytime I play against a new master, I also feel like I'm basically at the beginning again.
I think it helps go into the replayability a lot. The same thing when I go against a new master, like my first time against Titania, like, I had no idea what she did, and she just like jumped around. Oh, maybe I can kill her, but nope, every turn she's just like draining my guys of HP,
right,
reducing all my damage. But it was really nice for me coming away from that game and knowing like next time I want to try this, or I'll try and do this to counter it. Whereas like with a lot of other games I played, Like, for example, I was in a Underworlds tournament not too long ago. In Underworlds tournaments, you keep your same deck, your same warband, play a best of 3. But between each round, you can't, like, change your warband, or you can't, like, switch out cards. So the only thing that really changes by any amount is kind of the map layout.
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of drove home to me, I guess, a lot of points that I started to enjoy about Malifaux, because playing in that game, the first game I lost to my opponent by 20 points, the second game I won by 20 points, and the third one I lost by 20 points again.
Wow.
But every single round, I had the exact same strategy. Like, nothing changed round to round.
Right.
It's just, in one game I happened to beat him by 20 points. It's just like a huge difference in Underworlds. And the other 2 games I lost. And then coming away from that, I didn't really have a takeaway from that game. I wasn't like, oh, next game I can try this, because, like, I did the exact same thing, and, like, in just one instance it worked amazingly well, and in the other ones, like, it wasn't great. And I was like, I feel like my only takeaway is, like, I just need to roll better.
That does help.
I mean, it helps, but that's not helpful, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I agree with you, Colgan. Being able in Malifaux to know where I can make improvements in the next game is big, and that's something that we haven't really talked about. For those of you new to Malifaux, it's not a game where you build a list and then go to an event and you're stuck with that list. Game to game, you can adjust what you bring to the table to fit the opponent, to fit the terrain, to fit the scheme and strategy. So it really rewards you for experimenting and for trying new things. And as someone who has an addiction to plastic crack, I love that.
Well, and a lot of these selection elements rely on experience with the game, right? Malifaux is a game where individual players' skill matters a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, if you're a newer player entering a more established meta, it can be rough at the start, because even if they're a welcoming group of people who aren't looking to stomp you, they can't forget that they know these things, and it's going to come into play how they appreciate the terrain and how they appreciate the objectives of the game. And in our meta, we've been introducing a lot of newer players to the game, and we have come up with a procedure that works fairly well for us, but it took a good deal of experimenting to find a format that we thought was effective for teaching newer players. And Colgan was kind of our guinea pig, because his first game was probably not the best way to learn, was it, Colgan?
Yeah, this is like the reason why you don't just respond to anonymous people on the fucking internet.
Well, we appreciate you sticking around despite that. And yeah, we are definitely going to go more in depth on that demo process we've developed in a later episode, because I know, Jeff, you've seen a lot of people asking about, how do I get into Malifaux? How do I start? And you've kind of taken the charge, at least here in Los Angeles, about answering that question, right?
Well, I mean, I've been trying to lure more people out, because unfortunately we added Colgan and he's really good. So I'd like to try to add some people who, I mean, they're still good, but they're at a point where I could beat them reliably. But yeah, I mean, we will definitely revisit this demo topic, because I do think it is important. But when we, I think, taught Colgan, if I recall correctly, we just kind of broke out a full size game.
Right.
And that was probably a bit much to take in.
That's fair. But I mean, like, starting out, bare bones, Jeff, in your experience running people through demos, what is it that a player wants for a full game experience of Malifaux?
When you're ready to play the game of Malifaux, when you've decided this is something that you want to do, you're going to need a crew to play the game. Typically, that means you should select the master that appeals to you. The game has I think, almost 60 different masters. They all have their own aesthetic, and they all have their own play style. And I think it's just kind of looking at the factions and looking at the masters and seeing which one speaks to you. And some people pick based on mechanics, and some people pick based on aesthetics. Right, Jim?
Yes, because clearly aesthetics are superior. I kid, but seriously, the world of Malifaux is a kitchen sink. Any kind of thing you can imagine, there is a keyword for it. And for me, when I'm sitting down to build, paint, and play with my little plastic soldiers, I want to do it with little plastic soldiers that I'm really jazzed to spend the time building and painting them.
Right.
Because in Warhammer, in my Warhammer background, I spent a lot of time with gray plastic. And gray plastic, while that's fun for as far as gameplay goes, when I spend my time painting my Ultramarines up and I'm against a horde of gray plastic whatever, I feel like, man, this is jarring me out of the game experience.
Yeah, as far as the aesthetics things, that was another thing that I found really interesting about Malifaux, because coming into it, it seemed like it had a really confused identity at first. Like, you have the guilds who are kind of like your frontiersmen, like Western cowboyish people, and they have your resurrectionists who are like necromancers, a bunch of hillbilly gremlins running around.
Best faction.
And it just kind of felt like it was like a bunch of people came together, and it's like, well, we commissioned a bunch of different people for the art, and we don't want to redo it, so figure something out.
Okay.
Well, so fortunately, of course, there are the lore resources that Jim mentioned earlier, the podcast and the e-zine, where you can see the development of the story over time. But for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with Malifaux, the way I generally describe it is that it's a Victorian steampunk horror game. It's set in a world where magic has pretty much always existed. It kind of died out on Earth, but there's this portal to this other world called Malifaux where magic is much more common. It basically permeates the air, and it's so common that you can store it in these special gems called soul stones, which the guild then imports back to Earth at massive profit. And so it's really the driving engine behind technology and the economy.
Yeah, and then like after getting in the lore, it was actually really kind of cool to see how all these seemingly like disparate ideas actually start to tie together and kind of build, I guess, at least to me, a more or less like fairly consistent world.
Right. And the tagline for the game is "Bad things happen." Right. It's explicitly kind of a darker setting, but it's easy to overdo that, I think. And Weird was pretty clever in appreciating that if everything is just grim all the time, it can get, I don't know, sort of exhausting. So the Bayou faction, these hillbilly gremlins, these native little creatures of Malifaux who when they saw humans and saw human society, just kind of, they didn't really understand it, so they just sort of aped it in kind of a perverse way. They help add a comedic element to the game that I think makes it much more refreshing.
I don't know what you're talking about, not understanding it. Clearly, the government is run by the person with the biggest hat. So clearly, whoever has the biggest hat is in charge. That's just science. To be fair, we have talked about the fact that every master has their own play style. And some people do come to the game and don't necessarily want to get all into which steampunk zombie versus ninja warrior story or cowboy nonsense. They want to play a game. And so I think it is a legitimate reason to go into the game and look at different masters based on how they perform on the table. I mean, Colgan, you did that with Nelly, right?
Yeah. I guess as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to try playing, a crew, in this case Nelly and the journalist, that focused on the strategic and non-combat elements of the game to try and kind of like speed up the process of learning actually how Malifaux works. And I know since we've been getting so many new people to our meta and like talking through them and trying to figure out what play styles they like, I guess my experience with people in general is a lot of people that have like a background in Magic the Gathering, they would have very, I guess, well-defined ideas of play styles they enjoyed. Whether it's like hyper aggro or control, and even within those, it'd be like certain types of aggro and like more static control or more active control and stuff like that. And it would be really cool because one of the things that makes it easier for newer people to get into Malifaux, all the rules for the game and all the rules for the models are freely available. So these people would come and I say, oh, if you like control, like these are some of the masters you can start looking at. You can download the app and kind of look through all the cards and get an idea of how they play.
Yeah, I think when you are first starting out, there's a lot of information to take in, right? There's just a lot of choices, and it can be kind of difficult to, I guess, narrow down your options into what does fit what you're looking for, whether it's based on aesthetics or mechanics. Fortunately, there's no real shortage of places that you can go to get Malifaux information. And Colgan, when you were first starting out, what are some of the places online that you sort of looked and found useful?
Yeah, I guess I would go on like the weird forums to look through stuff. Once they actually release their full featured app, which, yeah, if anyone that doesn't have it or newer players, you can find it on the App Store. I think it's the M3E Crew Builder. Just having access to all that information was great for me because I'm the kind of person when I start a new game, I like reading everything about it. Like I really enjoy creating army lists or just kind of theory crafting everything. So having all that information available to me from the outset and knowing that was like official and up to date was really helpful in like looking at new crews or thinking about, you know, like which keyword or which master I wanted to pursue next.
Right. And so, Jim, aside from kind of these official forums, there's a lot of third-party and individual player content out there as well, right?
There is. I mean, first off, I'm just going to say, the easiest answer to what crew do I start with is all of them. I don't have a problem with buying more crews than I can possibly play. But one of the things I enjoy is there's a few really good options via YouTube. There's very good options via podcast. There is content out there of actual play of games and just a lot of content being generated, like the content we're generating here, about Malifaux. And personally, I work from home. I worked from home before it was legally mandated. And part of the way I spend my time is consuming this stuff. So if you are curious, I definitely recommend, looking into the various podcasts that are out there, the various YouTubes. And if you want to try playing the game, especially if you're listening to this while we're still under various stay-at-home orders, here in California we're under mandatory stay-at-home, there's this program called Vassal. It's free, and you can play Malifaux online with people around the world. I can say that because I have done this thing, and it's also a great way to test a crew before you buy it.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I'll think about, man, I really want to try this keyword, and you can proxy it if a friend has the keyword and they're willing to lend it to you. But if no one in your community has the keyword or it's not out yet, and you're like, man, I really want to see how Dashel works, you can pop open Vassal. You can play a game with Dashel and be like, oh, that's how it is. And for me, I use that to test out things like trying out deployments, trying out just like what does it look like on the tabletop so I can visualize it. There's a lot out there, and there's more coming in the future as, more of these models become available, as more tools and accessibility comes out to people. Definitely, I've spent more than my fair share of time on the app building crews like Colgan mentioned. I mean, heck, just if you look for it, it's out there.
Right. Now, Vassal, the program you mentioned, if I understand correctly, that's not a Malifaux-specific program. That's a program that exists to facilitate playing war games and board games online.
Correct.
Right?
It's like Tabletop Simulator, but it's free.
So it's not made specifically for Malifaux. So it has a more general interface because it has to be able to accommodate any game, right? But people can make these different modules, and someone has made a module for Malifaux, and that lets you play it over Vassal. But it's not always the most intuitive interface.
No, it is not. And for that reason, I want to applaud Colgan for taking the time to create like a get started guide on it.
Yay me.
I mean, you say that, but I found the guide quite useful. When I played Malifaux over Vassal for the first time with Jim a couple of weeks ago in a game that took approximately 19 hours.
That's not fair to yourself. It was only 16 and a half.
And even though my play was very slow, it would have been much worse without your guide. So I found your guide to be really useful, and we will be sharing a link to that guide in the show notes, because if any of you want to give Vassal a try, I think you'll find it helpful to have the guide to reference. So, what's next for us? If you've managed to sit through the entire episode, we appreciate it. We plan to continue with more rambling. In episode 2, we're going to continue the Welcome to Malifaux series, and it's going to be part 2, going to 50 Stones, where we kind of talk about when you're ready to play your full game for the first time. And we hope that you will give that a listen when it drops.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening, those of you who are stuck around, and let us know what you think. Let us know what kind of material you'd like to hear from us. We're called The Other Coast because a lot of content that's out there right now, at least in the States, is coming from the East Coast. And, well, we're on the West Coast, so it makes sense. But we're also trying to bring out, different approaches to the game, because there's more than one way to play Malifaux. So if there's something that you want to hear about or you want us to explore, let us know.
Yeah, and if you'd like to support the channel, we have links to all the standard social media things, so please like, comment, or subscribe. We would love to hear from you directly. You can send us an email. You can send us a hate mail over the various internet mediums that exist.
Please don't send us hate mail.
Yeah, we're very fragile. We're brand new at this.
Just address it to Jeff.
We also have a PayPal and Patreon if you'd like to support the channel in that way too. And, any sort of interaction is appreciated. We are doing this for us, but we totally would like to hear from you. So that will do it for episode 1. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.